Today we are talking about tic disorder treatment. Treatment is not a word that I use in my practice because that's not what we do here. We're not treating anything. We are giving you a roadmap to get back to health. But we're going to talk about treatments today. So we're going to talk about conventional treatments for tics and Tourette's. So there's this study, and it was done in 2020. So it is, well, not necessarily a study. It is a review of current treatments for Tourette's and tic disorders. And so this was done in 2020. This is a PubMed study or review. I read a lot of PubMed studies, and then I get on here and break them down. Like, what are we missing from these studies? And so when I came across this study, I was a little bit floored because the only thing we were talking about is medications and other contraptions. We do talk a little bit about CBIT in here, but as far as treatments, it's very narrow. And so this is really where I'm like, there are so many people looking for help for their children's Tourette's, their children's tic disorders. Maybe it's you with tics and Tourette's. And we come across these reviews or studies, and they are very limiting, meaning they're not giving us a whole huge broad view of all of the different things that you can do for tic disorders. Next week, we're going to talk about alternatives. And we will talk a little bit about how we work this morning. But what I found really interesting is that one of the very first things in this review is that we talk about pharmacological options. And so you guys have heard me talk about this. There's a study out of Cincinnati Children's Hospital that basically says medications prescribed for tics will not cure tics. Rarely do those medications reduce symptoms more than 50%. Are we told that when we go get all our prescriptions? No, we are not. And then finally, they are prescribed off-label. So most of the medications prescribed for tics and Tourette's are not designed for tics and Tourette's. They are prescribed off-label. So when we start to look at the number one option, well, I'm going to say the number one option for treating tic disorders is just ignore it, sweep it under the rug. And I'm sure how many of you here have been told just ignore it, maybe they'll grow out of it. Yes, give me a yes if that is you, if you have been told that maybe they'll just ignore it. Maybe they'll just grow out of it, just ignore it. And I find that to be one of the most frustrating things as a parent is that we're told to ignore our child's symptoms. We're told not to talk to them about it because it might make it worse. When in all actuality, you have this child who's struggling and they're afraid, and we're not going to talk about what's going on with their body and their uncontrollable movements. Like, that to me is absolutely insane. So anyway, the kind of first thing that they talk about in this review is pharmacological options. And based on, what Cincinnati Children's Hospital is saying, I find it very interesting because I look at tic disorders from a very different perspective. I look at tics like your body's check engine light. It is a signal that something is going on deeper in the body. It is our way, and I had a client tell me this. She feels like her son having a tic disorder was a blessing. And I've never thought about it that way, but I absolutely agree with her because there are so many kids out there that are sick and struggling, and we're just like, oh, they're teenagers, they're in a bad mood, they just can't focus. We're not looking at what's really going on inside their bodies. And it may be kind of the case for you where you have two kids. Maybe you have one who has tics and one who doesn't have tics, but you're like, well, this kid has a rotten attitude. So then we start to look at, well, is his rotten attitude from similar things that are going on in his body and they're just expressing differently and we're not catching them? So when she said, tics were a blessing, I thought that really is true because so many of us are able to look at our kids and say, ooh, something is wrong. That check engine light is on. What is happening? Where do we need to go? And what do we need to look for? So I found that really, really interesting. So when we go back to this review and we look at the pharmacological recommendations for tic disorders, most of those medications are used to lessen dopamine. So how many of you have gone to the doctor and they've tested your kid and said, oh, they don't have enough dopamine, we're going to give them this medication? Nobody, because that's not what's happening. They are working, conventional treatments are working under the assumption that your tic disorder is caused by too much dopamine. And so we're going to give you something to lower your dopamine. What I find completely fascinating in that aspect is drugs like Haldol, Risperdal, or app that they are prescribing to help control tics have a couple of really great side effects. One of them is weight gain, but the other one is involuntary repetitive movements. We are giving our kids these medication to stop their involuntary repetitive movements, but the side effects of the medication that lessen the dopamine can increase involuntary repetitive movements. Does that make sense? It makes zero sense to me. And we're not testing these kids to figure out, well, what really is happening? Where might these tics be coming from? Where might they be having these uncontrollable body movements? What is happening? We're not looking at that. We're just like, here's your prescription, go home. And usually, most of us are not given a prescription until we have ignored it for several months and not talked about it and just had lived with this giant elephant in the room. And now we're back at the doctor because we're all very frustrated from not talking about it, just ignoring it, trying to sweep it under the rug, and symptoms are getting worse. So then we go back to the doctor and they're like, here, have a prescription. In our case, they gave us 6 prescriptions. In our case, we got off of 6 prescriptions. So when we are looking at that conventional approach, when we look at this review, these drugs are really kind of that standard thing that's being prescribed. And we look at those, what are those side effects? What is going on? There's a couple other things that are prescribed for tic disorders. Tetrabenzine, how's that tongue twister? And it can cause depression. So we're trying to rob Peter to pay Paul. We're trying to stop tics, but then we're giving our kids depression. Because you have to consider that when you are taking a medication, those medications are going to alter your biochemistry. Your biochemistry is how your body is running on a daily basis. Those medications are going to alter your biochemistry. And we've never really looked at like, well, do they need that actual biochemistry altered? We haven't tested, we don't know. All right, so then we continue to scroll through this review. And so we've looked at all of these. Basically, most of the things that we are looking at are those drugs that are gonna block dopamine. Does your kid really need their dopamine blocked? I'm gonna say probably not, because what I find when I start to look at genetics is that our kids don't have enough nutrition in that pathway in order to create enough serotonin and dopamine in the first place. So we're trying to block dopamine in a system that for most of my clients do not need any dopamine blocked. So we're not really looking at what is really gonna be the most beneficial thing. So things like clonidine, those are prescribed for things like seizures. Sometimes it's prescribed for ADHD. We can look at, any of those other drugs. That guanfacine, we know that guanfacine is one of the major ones. I see a lot of clients come to me who are using guanfacine. Maybe it worked for a hot minute, doesn't work very well anymore, doesn't work at all anymore. And you have to consider that once you've started these medications, there is a weaning period to get off of these, meaning you have to work with your prescribing physician to wean yourself off of these meds. And I know for some of my clients, it can take months to get off things like clonidine. You're not supposed to just stop it, cold turkey. Then we start to look at, well, what are some other options? What are some other things that we're looking at? Botulism, so Botox. Botox is some of those things that they are now trying to use for tic disorders. So maybe if your kid is jerking their neck, they're going to inject that muscle with some Botox in their neck to see if they can ease those symptoms. You're injecting your kid with a biotoxin, comes from Botox, botulinum. I mean, Botox comes from botulism. If you ever have a can or a jar that's fat and bloated, you're not supposed to eat it because botulism. No, I do not get my forehead injected with Botox. I'm not getting injected with a toxin. Thank you. That doesn't sound like fun. I am Wednesday going to get injected with glutathione, which is even better. And it's just glutathione. So we have to look at, we're using medications, we're using prescriptions, we're using botulism, we're using some Botox in there. There's also some miscellaneous drugs on here that have been used and made in recommendations. Then we have some non-pharmacological options. So when we're looking at that conventional approach for treatment, deep brain stimulation. Deep brain stimulation. This one gets me because when I think about my son and what he was going through, would I have done some deep brain stimulation? No, because his brain is a precious commodity. I would have been terrified to do something like that. I feel like when we're doing something like deep brain stimulation, we're completely overlooking those underlying factors that you guys hear me talk about. I'm always talking about so many kids that I'm working with are dealing with underlying infections. They're dealing with leaky gut. They're dealing with food sensitivity. They're dealing with maybe mold toxicity or environmental toxins. They have all these underlying things that they're dealing with. Yet we have so many people that are just going to be like, well, I'm just going to go for the deep brain stimulation. Well, what if you do the deep brain stimulation, but you're really sensitive to gluten and you don't take out the gluten and you've done all of these things to your brain, but you never changed your diet, you never changed your lifestyle? To me, this is scary. I think deep brain stimulation sounds something very scary, just because I am very fearful of those actions within the brain. And my son can tell you that when he has a flare, or when he was really bad in the tics, he didn't need some deep brain stimulation. He didn't need dopamine to be lowered. He needed to reduce inflammation and change his diet and get rid of underlying infections. He had some underlying infections. So I mean, it is a treatment. It is on here on this review. Also looking at things like CBIT. So CBIT is comprehensive behavioral interventions for tics and Tourette's. And CBIT, I've had a lot of clients come to me who've done CBIT. It is very time consuming, and it's not always beneficial for the little ones because you have to do so much practice. It's really looking at competing movements. So if you feel like you have to move your neck because you're having a tic, when you go to CBIT, that therapist starts by teaching you like, okay, instead of moving your neck, you're going to move your fingers. So you're still doing a bodily movement. It is a competitive movement. You're just doing it in a certain manner, because so many people will tell you that they have to do the movement. They feel like if they don't do that tic movement, that their body is going to explode, that they are moved because they have to, not because they want to. And so comprehensive behavioral interventions are going to teach those competitive movements. However, I have colleagues, and we've had this conversation where they're teaching CBIT and we're doing what we're doing with the testing. And what they have found is that it's actually a really good combination. If you have a child who has that ability to sit down and do the CBIT, what else is on here? That's pretty much it. I mean, you don't have a lot of conventional options for quote unquote treatments. You have drugs, you have deep brain stimulation, you have CBIT, but that is really kind of what PubMed and what conventional medicine looks at for tic disorders. They are not looking under the hood. And next week we are going to talk about some alternative treatments. But the whole process of working with us at Regenerating Health is that we're going to look under the hood. We're going to look at over 1,000 biomarkers for some of you, maybe some of you not as much, depending on who we're working with and what you're dealing with. But we really want to know what's going on. Do you have leaky gut? Do you have environmental toxins? Do you have heavy metals? Do you have underlying infections? Do you have food sensitivities? What are these things that are going on inside your child's body? And this to me is extremely significant in helping to design a plan to get your child's health back on track. We're not guessing and saying, hey, we need to lower their dopamine. We're not guessing and saying maybe they need some deep brain stimulation. We really are able to look at that and say, these are the things that we need to work on. So that is where we're using what I call comprehensive neuroimmune analysis. We are looking in depth using testing at what is going on with your child. Then we take that data and we connect the dots. It's not just what's on paper, because sometimes you really have to hunt for those clues on the paper. But if we know all of these symptoms and this health history on this side, and we have all this data over here, we can then connect those dots and come up with long-term and short-term plans to help get your child or yourself back on track. So, when we're looking at those conventional treatments, I think most of us have tried not the deep brain stimulation. I'll say most of us probably haven't, but a lot of us have tried the therapies that are recommended. A lot of us have tried the drugs that are recommended. A lot of us have tried ignoring it, that is highly recommended. And I think that is frustrating for us as parents. And I know that is why so many of you are here looking for those alternative natural approaches. They work. They are not overnight. There is no magical pill, potion, or magic bean that is going to get rid of your symptoms overnight. It is a process. And not only that, like when you look at, you go get your prescription, now knowing that it's going to reduce, it may not reduce symptoms more than 50%, that's still not your magical pill, potion, or magic bean. It's still not doing what you're wanting it to do. So when we are looking at that, we have to look at, you have that conventional approach we just talked about, which is very much like medication, maybe some therapy, maybe some deep brain stimulation. Or we have these alternative approaches. We have these ways to start to look at what is going on inside your child's body. So that being said, was that information helpful?